strategy for community corrections in New South Wales. So Jason commenced his career with corrections as a probation and parole officer in 2004 after completing his studies in criminology and psychology. He completed a Masters of Criminology in 2011, including his thesis on the role of gender in the New South Wales approach to domestic violence. Jason has also worked as a research officer and data analyst, specialising in community corrections, and as a manager for community corrections performance and reporting. Jason has been primarily responsible for the development of the performance standard for community corrections in New South Wales, the development of current resourcing and service delivery models, and has been heavily involved in the development of correction strategies for meeting the Premier's priorities on domestic violence. Welcome, Jason.
Is this working? Yep, cool. I'm going to stand over here because I need my notes. All right, first of all, I'll say I'm a little bit nervous coming here today because I think what I'm saying is perhaps a little bit different to what you might be hearing elsewhere and perhaps expressed a little bit more strongly. But I'll start with a quote from Richard Feynman, who's a physicist, not a domestic violence worker, which is, "It doesn't matter how beautiful your theory is, it doesn't matter how smart you are. If it doesn't agree with evidence, it's wrong," or with experiment in this case. Okay, and I guess the point of what I'm trying to get at today is not to say that everything in the domestic violence space as we know it is wrong. The point is there's a lot more out there, and that it's a very selective process in terms of what we look at and what we ignore in the domestic violence space. And the point that I want to get to ultimately is not to say, oh, it's terrible that we're missing all of these other areas and we should be looking at it, but it's a little bit deeper than that. It's that in missing this other stuff, we actually undermine some of what we're trying to achieve, particularly in terms of identifying gender roles and what it means to be male and female. Okay, so try and keep that in the back of your head because I know some of the stuff that I'll present might sort of irk at some of you. Okay. So, but to try and summarise the point that I'm getting at to as well, I want to give you a little bit of a scenario. So you may have, if you came to the staff development seminar last year, have seen a variation on this. So a man has a long history of violence against many partners. He engages in just about every form of abuse, physical and psychological, and enjoys inflicting pain. He's been to prison multiple times for short periods, but always reoffends. He's just been arrested again for beating and raping his latest partner in front of her children. The man is likely to get 5 years imprisonment with 3 years non-parole if convicted. A wonder cure for abusers has been developed with a 100% success rate, producing dramatic positive changes in behaviour. It consists of a surgical procedure and due to medical ethics can only be done voluntarily. He is offered the treatment but says he will only consent to it if all the charges are dropped and he is provided with $100,000 compensation for undergoing the surgery. Should he be given the option? I don't need an answer. I want you to think about that. I want you to think about what is more important. Is it more important to hold him accountable, or is it more important to prevent more people from being victimised and abused? Because we know that sending him to prison won't achieve that. Now, clearly this is a fictional scenario. It's never going to happen because we don't have that wonder cure. But the point that I'm getting at there is what matters. What is our real priority? Demonising men, holding them accountable, or stopping them from being violent? So this is sort of the couple of questions I just want to go through. Again, this is more about provoking thought than coming to any definitive conclusion. But what is domestic violence? How is gender used? What are the limitations of this approach? And what could be done better? So what is domestic violence? So this is off the DV New South Wales website. This is not something that you're going to be familiar with already. There's a whole range of different behaviours: verbal, psychological, emotional, sexual, and so forth. There's a couple that I kind of want to draw out though, which are, and I think this is one of the points that I want to get to too, is that we talk about violence, and when we say violence in a sort of general public context, it means something very different to what we say in the domestic violence space. So we include all of these things, so financial violence, for example, if you said that to a member of the general public, it sort of doesn't really, you beat someone over the head with a wad of money, Now, we know what that means in a domestic violence context, but I guess what I want to draw attention to is that we use language very differently when we're talking about domestic violence to what we do in other contexts. And that's something that I think occasionally causes confusion. Okay. And one of the things which I think we're all familiar with is the concept that the emotional and psychological abuse is often more damaging than the physical abuse. Okay? And research shows that whether you're a man or a woman, emotional abuse is considered far more detrimental and long-lasting than physical abuse. So there's other factors. We talk about women being murdered by their partners, but the other side of it too is that there's evidence for increased risks of suicide. Okay, so it's not just external harm, it's the harm that's conducted by the individual themselves. And significantly, looking at that area, it's worth bearing in mind that men commit suicide 3 times the rate of women. Okay, so of course I'm not saying there's a direct cause, but it's just something to think about. Okay. Now, one of the, I guess, things to bear in mind when we talk about that is when we look at statistics on domestic violence, and when we say 1 in 3 women has experienced violence and all of that, we keep reverting back to the act-based violence. So was there a physical blow struck? Now, we know this psychological stuff, the emotional stuff is more important, but as our point of reference, we keep going back to the physical. And I guess the question that I would ask is, every common assault that's charged by police, serious harm? And I think for anyone that's worked in the field, you would understand that there are differing degrees of this. The fact that somebody might be having an argument, say in the heat of a divorce or something, and someone calls the police and someone gets charged, doesn't necessarily mean that serious harm has occurred. And I think one of the best illustrations of this, perhaps, some United States jurisdictions have implemented mandatory arrest procedures, which have had an interesting unintended consequence, that far more women have started being arrested for domestic violence because they have engaged in those physical acts. Now, that's not to say that they're all abusers, but it sort of illustrates the point that the physical act of violence is not the same as serious harm. And conversely, we also understand that serious harm doesn't necessarily occur with physical violence. So perhaps the best illustration of that, sort of moving away from the domestic context for a moment, is a man walks into a bank, walks up to the teller and says, "Give me all the money or I'll punch you in the face." The teller says no, man starts going nuts, punching, kicking, maybe pulls out a knife, starts stabbing people. Another man walks into the bank, hands the teller a note, "I have a bomb, if you don't give me all the money, I'm going to blow the place up." No actual violence. Which one's worse? I would put it to you, probably the second one. Okay. So you don't need to go to that action in order to inflict serious debilitating harm, but we keep using it as our reference point. And one of the things that I guess I would point out in that context is that physical violence is a very male thing. We sort of associate physicality and strength with men, and so simply by defining domestic violence with reference to the physical, we're already starting to gender the approach to violence. So there's a lot of literature around domestic violence, and I guess this is something else that I want to point out, is that there's a whole bunch of different things. We talk about domestic violence as though it's a homogenous behaviour, but it's not. Particularly if you look at it in a legal context, to say what is domestic violence and includes all those physical acts, well, some of those physical acts occur very occasionally. It might be one instance, and it might be no one gets physically harmed. There's a little bit of a shake-up, but the relationship's fairly stable. And if I can, probably the best example of that would be not violence against a partner, it'd be violence against a child. How many people have smacked a disobedient child? Oh, didn't do them any harm, it's okay. The relationship's still loving, everyone goes on. And I would, in terms of the data that's available, and the data is very problematic because there's been a whole bunch of research by what's sort of become known as the gender symmetry debate to say that women and men use violence at comparable rates, but of course that doesn't then differentiate the qualitative nature of that violence. Then there's research in terms of expressive violence, controlling violence, all of that sort of stuff. So, for example, the Australian Bureau of Stats does a personal safety survey looking at rates of abusive behaviour or victimisation, I should say, amongst different groups. So that found 4.7% of women reported having experienced emotional abuse in the last 12 months, and 1.2% of women reported physical assault by an intimate partner. And here it's worth perhaps noting that we talk about the like say the 1 in 3 statistic, which is 1 in 3 women have experienced violence, but of that 1 in 3, only 30% that violence was by an intimate partner. Okay, so we keep conflating these different ideas around, you know, when is violence domestic violence, when is violence serious, and when is it not? And what tends to happen, what I tend to notice in this domain, is that when you talk about violence against men, now bear in mind that men get murdered at twice the rate of females. If you look across the entirety of the system, not just the domestic, men get murdered at twice the rate. Men experience similar levels of violence and whatnot. But we exclude that. Well, men's experience of violence is not as significant. You know, a man gets slapped in the face, you know, he's big, he's tough, he can deal with that. Okay, women's experience of violence, it's much more terrifying. Okay, so we need to count that more meaningfully. The problem is then we use the numbers that relate to every single act of violence to say that it's all fits within that bucket. So that's sort of a baseline definitional sort of issues around the act versus the psychological. Now, this probably doesn't even need saying, but domestic violence is often used as or a synonym for domestic violence is violence against women. And so I've got a quote there from the Prime Minister in 2015. Domestic violence, which is just violence against women. Real men don't hit women. Our vision is for a world where women and children live free from violence. The New South Wales Domestic and Violence Blueprint, I think, has progressed a little bit. At least it's safer lives for women, men and children now, but it still falls under the Women New South Wales. And then, of course, the current campaign, which sort of is the namesake for this conference, is violence against women. Let's stop it at the start. And I think that last one in particular, I'd like to emphasise that concept of stopping it at the start. Okay, when we start thinking about gender identity and what it means to be a male in a relationship or a female in a relationship, that we're not necessarily, in some of the ideas that I'm going to sort of go into, we're not necessarily talking about people that are already, you know, got 10 years of abusing their spouse. It might be people that are coming up, you know, their late teens into adult relationships, and how these sorts of messages can influence their behaviour. Okay. So I've already sort of noted this before, but when a majority of women are victims, the New South Wales Government is committed to ensuring the safety of women in their homes and families, public places and the workplace. When a majority of men are victims, the New South Wales Government is acting on drug and alcohol violence. So being young, single and male are the most significant predictors of self-reported alcohol-related victimisation. Now, should this be gendered? Probably not. Does it say something about men as victims, men as abusers? I would say yes, it does. So why gender? And which gender? So we could say, well, why does it matter? We know in the domestic violence space, mostly women victims, mostly male perpetrators. Male privilege plays some part. Gender inequality is the bigger picture here, so it's not just about domestic violence, it's about gender equality. This quote, which you may be familiar with, sort of I think underscores what I've been talking about in terms of male victimisation is dismissed, female victimisation is sort of elevated, is that men's greatest fear is that women will laugh at them, while women's greatest fear is that men will kill them. Okay. Women experience physical assault 4.8 times more often than men in intimate relationships. Again, we're putting in a very specific context and then using sort of a broader measurement. What I find interesting is if you go a little bit outside of that, so we look at that and we say, oh, it's terrible. Men clearly have no respect for women. They're out to abuse women any chance they can get. But the reality is that whether you're a man or a woman, you're still 5.5 times more likely to be assaulted by another man. There's no discrimination in that sense. And it goes the other way too. So women rate of abuse towards men and towards other women is similar. It's that men abuse everyone more, and women, at least physically, abused less. Again, going back to that physical definition. Now, yes, there's a lot of problems with all of this data. There's a lot of problems with context and whatnot, but I think it's an important point to bear in mind when we start making assumptions about male aggression and say, look at all this imagery in relation to male violence towards women. Now, I agree it's problematic. I agree that it's not appropriate. But if you dig a little bit deeper, you'll also find an awful lot of just generally violent material. So if you play a lot of video games, for example, that's sort of an example that's been raised today. The majority of those video games, yes, you can find games like Grand Theft Auto that have sexualised violence towards women, but in the majority of video games, the violence is directed towards other males. And women, children are sort of the innocents, if you like, within that context. I'm not saying that to excuse the other stuff. I'm saying to put that in a broader context, that it's not just about that stuff. So in terms of looking at the issue then of, well, is this about attitudes towards men and women, or attitudes of men towards women, and some of the messaging that comes along with that. So this is from the Stop It at the Start campaign, Stop the Excuses. So looking at, well, where does all of this stuff come from? So it comes from attitudes, cultural norms, and the way that people are raised. So we've got here a few examples. So these ones are sort of at the highlights in the Stop the Excuses campaign. So some of the ways we excuse disrespectful and aggressive behaviour. So playing it down, don't worry, it wasn't that bad. Boys will be boys, it takes two to tango. It's okay, he probably did it because he likes you. Now I just want to unpackage a couple of those. So blaming girls, it takes two to tango. Now, the obvious problem with this is if you say that, you're saying, look, you probably did something to deserve it. Okay? It doesn't matter what the context is. The problem is if you say that it's never appropriate to say that, you also have to say that in the context of a man saying, well, my girlfriend just slapped me in the face. Well, what's your immediate reaction to that? Oh, you must have said something to deserve it. So I think in dismissing it in the way that sort of is being suggested through this challenging of gendered thinking around relationship conflict, we have to be careful that we're not going the other direction too far. We're not saying, you know what, it takes two to tango all the time, but you know what, sometimes it does. Sometimes it's about each partner being disrespectful to each other. Sometimes it's one-sided, sometimes it's one person dominating the other, and sometimes it's not. And sometimes, like in the example that I've just given of a woman slapping a man in the face, which seems to be a fairly sort of well-accepted behaviour if the man's being a pig, is that sometimes an act of physical violence may well be in response, and I'm not saying this is the case in all domestic violence, I'm saying it might be a factor in some, where you have one person that's engaging in abusive behaviour towards the other, sometimes that person will respond in a physically violent way. We need to think a little bit bigger than just who acted physically and look at the broader behaviour. And say that it's not okay for anyone to disrespect the other person. It's not okay to be violent to anybody. Okay? Similarly, I think we also need to be careful in all of the hyperbole that we put into this, trying to say this is a really important issue, that we don't step too far and make people feel victimised when they've experienced something that maybe isn't that significant, okay? And I'm not saying telling the battered woman that's turned up to a shelter homeless with her kids and black eyes, oh, it's not that bad. I'm saying, in terms of this campaign, for example, telling girls that if your boyfriend's a bit of a dick, that makes you a victim of domestic violence, probably isn't the best way to go either. Okay? And that the real question is not so much, you know, if something happens, if somebody else does something that's inappropriate, we don't come to them and say, you know, don't worry, it's not that bad, he can do whatever he likes, you've just got to deal with it. But that we don't also say, oh my God, you've been a victim. Well, the question really needs to be, are you okay? Did that affect you? And validating that response rather than imposing this idea of victimisation. Because again, it feeds into that idea. Men are big, strong, nasty people. Women must always be weak victims. Some of it's got to be about empowering and saying, you know what, he's a dick. So what? So I just want to look at this particular one just briefly to say, the narrative around this in the Stop the Excuses one has a few examples that are very similar to this, which talk about male responses to their female partner. So some of these are around, she has you under the thumb, you should be in control, all of that sort of stuff. There's another one, I'm trying to remember what the message was, but that's right, you should just do what she wants. So the countervailing sort of message was, well, you should value what your girlfriend wants. And I guess my question is, what if that was the statement? What if it was a woman who was saying that the male is in control of her? And why is it that we belittle men who aren't in control and tell them to shut up and just do what their wife expects of them? And I guess that comes back to the issue of, well, what is power and control? And how does violence fit into that? And is physical violence really a defining feature of domestic violence, or is it one symptom of something else? Okay. So one sort of approach which was suggested, I think it was by, there you go, it was Julie Stubbs, is that the violence itself obviously plays a role, but the real issue there is not the violent act, it's what the violent act says about how you relate to the other person. It's a violation of trust. It's a message that sort of says, I don't really care about you, I don't care about your rights, I'm willing to put my desire to express myself over your right to feel safe. And in that context, the violence is not the important bit. It's that control. So here's another sort of definition which I think sort of sums it up fairly well. So domestic violence is the pattern and repeated use of coercive and controlling behaviour to limit, direct and shape a partner's thoughts, feelings and actions. So then that begs the question, well, can, for example, a woman be controlling in a relationship, and is that domestic violence? Even if she's not physically violent. You know, we tend to just dismiss it. And what tends to come up in that context then is, well, it's not about that individual relationship, it's about gender equality as a whole. So what does gender equality mean? It's about men having intrinsically more power in society than women. So I just want to sort of look at, well, how is that defined? And this is the sort of thing that generally comes out when we look at gender equality and the distribution of power between men and women. So we look at things like average full-time weekly wage, superannuation, how many women are on boards of directors, discrimination in the workplace and whatnot. And I guess what I want to ask in all of this is not to say that's wrong, but I want to ask, what is it that we're trying to achieve there and how are we trying to achieve it? So if I say to you that the average, for every dollar that a man earns, a woman earns 82 cents, I think the general message is, well, we've got to get the woman up to $1. And I want to put it to you that perhaps a more productive way of starting to think about this debate is not just in terms of male equality as females coming up to where men are, but maybe pushing men down a little bit. And whether that might be a more productive way of looking at the problem. And I want to put that in the context of what is it that we actually value. And who has ever heard, old person, what are the things you regret in my life? I wish I'd spent more time at work. I wish I'd earned more money. No one says it. Why on earth do we continue to push this as the idea of what equality is about? And if we look at that in the context of gender, we're just reinforcing the same masculine ideals. We're not saying that men and women should be equal. What we are saying is that women should be more like men, that women should have access to the same powers as men. And I think when you go back to that, it was raised earlier, I think it was it Tony that said it? I can't remember. The idea of how do you define then? We tell men, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, but we need to provide a positive ideal that they can work towards. And you don't do that by simply telling them, stop doing all the bad stuff and let's get women up to your level. You have to take it the other way as well. So we need to start looking at, well, how can we get equality? Well, maybe some of that's around getting men more into the childcare role as well. That redefines what masculinity is. It gets them a greater appreciation of domestic responsibilities and whatnot, and stops sort of pushing that masculine idea of equality. So there's one other area that I want to touch on as well, which I think is also overlooked. I think I've already mentioned it briefly in terms of the idea of assault on children as a sort of counterpoint. So this is not just a male-female thing. This is also, I think, the one thing that gets overlooked in this whole debate is the role of children. And I know, it's women and children, but the reality is when you look at most of the material in terms of how children fit within the domestic violence space, it's usually as pawns in the relationship. So not that children experience domestic violence, but that children are used as a means of getting at the woman. So you abuse the child as a form of domestic violence against the women. The children do not experience domestic violence themselves. Now you think about that, household, the man's behaving the same to, the wife, children, abusing all of them, they're all living in fear. They have the same experiences. And despite sort of all of the rhetoric around how terrible domestic violence is, we still legally have a definition which allows you to assault a child. So 61AA of the Crimes Act, if criminal proceedings brought against a person arising out of the application of physical force to a child, it is a defence that the force was applied for the purpose of punishment of the child. So all the rhetoric from the government, domestic violence is bad, family violence is bad, it's legally permissible. The other thing that I would sort of reinforce, this is just the first section of the whole, there's quite a lengthy part. The other thing that I'd reinforce in that context is that only is available as a defence in a domestic relationship or where the person is acting on behalf of the child. So for example, in a juvenile justice setting, a juvenile justice worker doesn't have the right to assault a child. A police officer doesn't have a right to assault a child, no matter how badly they're behaving. So a kid committing, some serious offence, we can't smack them, but they forget to put the dishes in the dishwasher, it's okay to hit them. Okay? Now I'm a parent and a realist. I can't say that I smack my kids, but I certainly understand the frustrations that lead to it. And little bastards. And I think it's unrealistic to expect that you're ever going to eradicate any form of physical violence against children, but I think that says something about how we approach it. And I think the other thing that, we like to think of ourselves as an advanced, we're, fairly out there. We're not like those countries that, those South African, sorry, not South African, I'm losing my... those African countries or those Middle Eastern countries that, that don't respect women and, we're better than that. But there's widespread support for it. I think the last survey data I saw on it was about 70% of Australians support corporal punishment of children. Kids need discipline. My mum used the wooden spoon on me, I turned out okay. It's completely different. I'll take you back to where does it start? It also contravenes the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. There are 50 other countries, including Sudan, I might add, that have already outlawed it. Does it stop the behaviour? No. Does it send a message to the community about what's acceptable? Yes. There are 56 more planning to introduce bans. In terms of gender, there's been numerous studies. A lot of these, some studies have been across multiple countries, multiple cultures. And the general theme that comes out of them is that mothers use corporal punishment more often than fathers. Sons are also subjected to corporal punishment more often than daughters. So there is a gender bias in that respect. It's not as significant. But there was one particular study, I think it looked at, I'm trying to remember the details, it was over a sample size of several thousand, which looked at the relationship between the use of violence by a parent and then the behaviour of the child over the next 7 or so years, which indicated that it was use of violence by the mother that was more predictive of later aggression by the child than use of violence by the father. I'll juxtapose that with a statement in terms of the Women New South Wales stop it at the start. So fewer people realise where the behaviours and attitudes can start in childhood. So we say how we treat kids is really important, but then we condone the use of assault against children. And I put it to you that one of the reasons that we continue to allow that to happen is because we know that when we start talking about children, the mums come into it a lot more. We have to start talking about women being violent. But we're so far entrenched in this gendered notion of what violence is and who commits violence and who the victims are, that I think it's really uncomfortable to do that. The other thing that I think, sorry, just check I'm going for time. The other, I guess, part of that is that because we've built up this dichotomy around domestic violence is violence against women, we've started to shift a little bit away from the key defining feature of domestic violence. So if it wasn't domestic violence, it would just be violence. We already know that if it's just violence, the picture is radically different. So why do we ignore that part of it? Why do we just look at it's the male's responsibility against the female and not look at is there a dynamic in the relationship? Now, I need to be really, really clear here. I'm not saying we go out and start blaming all the victims, okay? But what I think we need to do is differentiate blame from causation, okay? And, you know, we see it, I think, in a lot of areas where we talk about prevention of violence, particularly against women and children, is that it's all about somebody else's responsibility. And I agree that it should be. I agree that it should be the responsibility of the perpetrator, but that's not the reality of the world that we live in. I still lock my car because it's a sensible thing to do, even though nobody has any right to steal my car. And again, it goes back to the original point, is are we more concerned with having the moral high ground or about stopping the violence? And in some cases, and I should say, again, to reinforce, in some cases, yes, you can completely point the finger at one person, okay? But we live in a big society. Not everybody's out there engaging in that coercive control. The mutual is the more common. One little bit that I found very interesting when I was doing or one little fact that I found really interesting when I was doing the research in my thesis was the work of Erin Pizzey. So Erin Pizzey was actually one of the very first people who pioneered the whole domestic violence movement and opened the very first women's shelter in the United Kingdom in 1971. Very quickly she came to realise that a proportion, not all, a proportion of the women that were coming to her shelter were themselves violent towards their children, towards their spouses, and that their actions, their behaviours fed into the cycle of violence. In some cases more so than their partners. So this has been recognised for a very long time. And I find it really interesting that the response to that when she started to publish these findings was that she started receiving death threats. And I kind of think, what does that say about the debate that we're having? So from feminists.
No, I've received death threats from partners of offenders.
Yes.
I've been called numerous names.
Yes.
By partners of offenders, not the
Yeah.
offenders themselves. Yeah, and received death threats on
Yeah.
2 occasions.
And what does that say? You know, if we can't have a discussion about if that's the sort of the level that we're at. So, and there is a large body of research demonstrating that women engage in violent and abusive behaviours. I guess one of the major problems with that is if you look at some of the qualitative studies that look at male victims, is that we know that women are reluctant to report. If women are reluctant to report, some of the men who call the domestic violence lines and get told, well, here's a service that can help you, and of course it's for perpetrators, that get laughed at, that get told. So some of the examples in the literature include fairly what you call macho professions. So there's been a lot of studies, particularly in the US military, which I found quite surprising, I have to say. I should point out, just on a personal note, I didn't sort of come to have this particular view about how we should do it. I came to it through a process of research, looking at what was out there, and was quite surprised to find that the rates of abusive behaviour by women were quite high in the US military, where you would think, big macho men running around with guns, trained to kill people, surely they can defend themselves. And that's exactly the point, is that the women thought, well, it's not that bad because, he's a big man, he can defend himself. And of course, the males were too terrified to reciprocate because they were concerned that they would hurt their spouse. Okay. Which is, sorry, I've jumped ahead of myself. So we talk about, in female criminality, some of you might have heard of the term double deviancy. That is, so a woman's supposed, women are generally seen as meek, non-violent, non-aggressive. So when they violate a law, that's seen to breach both the legal sort of definition of a law, but also social norms about what it means to be a female. And I would suggest to you that in the context of male victimisation, it's exactly the same thing. Men are meant to be big, strong, look after themselves. So when a male gets victimised, you get that double effect. I forgot to put my references in there, sorry. And so I guess this is the point that I want to get to, I'm trying to get to with all of this, is that in the way that we approach all of this, are we really challenging any of those gender stereotypes? So if you're a man, you're inherently violent, women need help, all men are empowered. So if you don't feel that way, there's something wrong with you. Promotion and career are the most important things. Men should take control of their actions. So what could be done better? I'm just going to skip over some of this because I know I'm running behind on time. Running over on time. So, for example, what do you think of the applicant for this job? This is sort of a gender inequity that we're sort of well familiar with. Well, she looks very good, but she'll want to have kids soon, so that could be a problem. But you know what? We've got a child-friendly policy. We can afford to work around it. It's kind of the ideal that we aspire to. I would put it to you that that's not terribly realistic. The reality is that we need, particularly as a sort of employer, having staff off for a year at a time does detrimentally impact on the business. Whatever the reason, doesn't mean anyone's at fault, but that's just the reality. You'd know that yourselves. You have a staff member off for an extended period of time, it can be a problem. So I'd suggest, well, what if we look at it a different way? She's excellent, very well qualified, she'll want to have kids soon, but you know what, it doesn't make any difference because all the men are taking paternity leave at the same time. So I just want to, visually illustrate the point, and then I'll finish up because I know I'm over time. So this is when you go looking at domestic violence material online, this is kind of what's out there in the domestic violence space. So you make the call, we'll make it stop. We'll stop the bad guys. Domestic violence isn't about losing control, it's about control. You're in control as a man. You should be able to govern your own behaviour. Sort of that guilting. Is this the childhood that you want for them? I'd like to contrast that with how we approach the child abuse space. Same problem. It's everyone's business. Parents, it's okay to reach out for support and some time out. Personally, I think there's a section in the, so facts are on this, looking at dads make a difference. Empowering men to get involved with their kids, giving practical, helpful tips, not just to say stop hitting your kids, but to say here's some stuff that you can do with them. The National Child Protection Week, we don't have a child huddled in a corner with the parents standing over them. We've got, kid playing with his father or grandfather. That messaging that we put in that domestic violence space, it might be nice, to feel good about these horrible bastards that are out there beating women, but is it productive? And is there a better way of doing it? And being mindful of the time, I might just wrap it up there.
My question was around working with these men from a practical purpose.
Mm-hmm.
We've got a lot of strategies, a lot of steps we can already take to deal with men as perpetrators. But we don't often get a lot of training or a lot of programs to help men who have been victims of abuse or victims of that violence. And a big problem that we have at Griffith is particularly that dual violence, where we do oftentimes have both the male and the female partner for similar offences. And do you have any suggestions on how we could perhaps challenge some of those stereotypes we have around working with them as perpetrator and victim, and how we work with men who are both perpetrators and victims?
To be honest, I struggle with that one. I'm not sure. I think the difficulty is, particularly where there's mutual violence. I think where there's one-sided violence, it's more straightforward, although not many of them come forward. One of the worst or most difficult cases like that I personally have worked with was a man who was on parole for malicious wounding, had beaten his wife quite severely. After speaking to him, doing the home visits, whatnot, it became quite apparent that she was the dominant partner. And what I eventually figured out was that she would abuse him regularly. He would go and get drunk and then he would unload on her. And I remember him coming into the office one day with like a bloodied face. His wife had kicked him out. He was homeless. He wanted help. And, I went through, well, we need to get you connected with services. He didn't want anything, because he knew, he was afraid that his parole was going to be revoked. And I don't know what to do with that, to be frank, because I think our system is so inherently biased towards men. I think it is improving slowly. I think some of the language has started to shift. I think it's really positive that at the very least, I think even if you look at domestic violence strategy generally, up until quite recently, it's been very focused on victim support and very little on perpetrator. And, if you think about that logically, it's a little bit like fixing road safety problems by investing more in hospitals so we can mop up the mess rather than fixing the roads. So look, in terms of the male victims, I wish I had a better answer for you. Other than, I don't know. I think we need more investment in that area. I think in terms of working with them as a perpetrator though, the important thing is not to bring assumptions and bias into the room, to have an open mind, and listen to the offender's story. And it's important not to collude with them and say, her bad behaviour justifies your bad behaviour. I think nothing justifies their bad behaviour, but at the same time, it's okay to accept that they have experienced abuse and acknowledge that, no, you shouldn't experience abuse either. I think that's probably, that sort of not bringing your assumptions is probably the most important.
firstly, I think your presentation is exceptionally welcome, and I would assume that we're coming from a very similar space in terms of gender symmetry and understanding and examining aggression. I think it's really welcome. And I think New South Wales is really lucky to have you as the director, in particular if this narrative starts to filter down into policy and practice. A couple of things, almost just to fine-tune and tweak what you've got up there. I still think there's an issue around seeing, although we've just touched upon it, seeing these mutually exclusive categories of victim and perpetrator. I think this really stems from kind of aggression literature, in particular the bullying literature, especially when we're looking at children, where we do see these gender differences in boys and girls, but that dissipates in adult years, and the literature is starting to emerge from that and support this kind of victim-perpetrator relationship. So I want to reflect on that in terms of what you're saying. It's also very heterosexual, and I think in terms of kind of a practitioner that's leading an organisation or a service in this way, it's important that we give the tools to the people on the ground to work with all clients, gender, sexuality, culturally different, so on and so forth. Final point I'll make is about the methodology that you quite rightly raise and the methodological weaknesses that we see in some of this gender symmetry research. And yesterday I touched upon that myself, self-reports, small sample sizes. However, there is methodological weaknesses in the research that's governed the practice over the last 30 years. The traditional theoretical gendered baseline we're working from has its methodological flaws. It hasn't stopped us from building our practice on that premise or on those premises. So while we need to recognise all the methodological weaknesses in all aspects of the research that's out there, there is useful stuff in that research that we can be using now and today and implementing in practice. But I think from that presentation, it is very encouraging and optimistic in terms of what may come from practice, in particular in New South Wales.
Thank you.
Thanks, Phil. There's one more question.
Jason, I found your presentation aspects are really hard to hear. And a lot of that wasn't specifically because confronting to me in a new way. It's a discussion that I've heard for many years. And I can see that you've made decisions to join with that discussion at different points in it, and have brought a whole range of different arguments from different areas together to support that position. The position that I would like to talk to you a little bit about, and maybe here isn't exactly the right spot, but is the sense of holding men accountable is demonising them. That hasn't been my experience. And I think in terms of asking men to think about how they behave can be done in a range of ways. And I come from a practitioner space. So as a practitioner, I'd stand with you about there's not much point. In fact, it's dangerous to talk about provocation. And I'd be much more interested in asking a man how did he feel about his own behaviour. Less about exploring what his partner might or might not be doing in relation to how he understands himself in the world. I think there is literature that would possibly support the idea that men's experiences of violence from female partners are often different in relation to that concept of fear. The conversations, and once again this is from a practitioner space, and I acknowledge that I do value and see post-structural feminist thought as an ally in this work. Not as an answer, but as an ally. That one of the important things when we think about those experiences for men is that we try to stay alongside what our theory makes more possible for the life of that man and for his partners and partner children. So when we're looking at how we understand what's going on for him, there is, I think, a collective experience for men that you did capture in some cases that attached to patriarchy and privilege. And obviously that dividend gets distributed differently depending on where that man sits in community. But I would just find it that there's certainly ways of working with men where asking them to take responsibility for responsible behaviour doesn't necessarily need to be restricted as demonising.
Look, I would agree with you, absolutely. But I guess the point that I would make is, so I guess the thrust of mine was more around the public and political messaging, so at the cultural level rather than at the one-to-one practitioner level. And I would agree with you that as you get into those lower levels, there does tend to be a shift away from that. But as you would have seen, like with the government posters and messaging and website, you know, it's the darkened room, you know, with the fist and the child or the woman carrying in the corner. It's presented, I think, at that level in a much more demonising way, where accountability is correlated more with, you know, what you're doing or you are a bad person. Then I think by the time you get down to the program level, it's a different conversation. But you don't shift cultural attitudes with individual programs. I guess that would be my point.
I just want to say thank you very much, Jason, for coming here today.
No worries.
Sort of gift for you to say
Thank you.
you.